Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to Madison's Notes, the official podcast of Princeton University's James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. I'm your host, Annika Nordquist. Today's guest is Oliver Traldi, who's currently a John and Daria Berry postdoctoral research fellow with us here at the Madison Program. He received his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Notre Dame and has recently published his first book, Political Beliefs: A Philosophical Introduction, a textbook which looks to explain the reasons that people have for political beliefs and disagreements. With no further ado, I hope you enjoy. Oliver, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So this book is about political beliefs, and I think people come at this topic from a lot of different angles. I think a psychological perspective or a historical perspective, and your book comes at it from this kind of very strictly philosophical perspective. So to kick us off here, can you kind of talk me through what you think that adds to the conversation that's otherwise missing?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that philosophy does that philosophers are sort of trained to do. One is just being super clear on things and being very rigorous. And this is something that in debates about political beliefs, I think can be really helpful. A lot of the literature from sort of the psychological or historical perspectives takes certain political beliefs for granted. Sort of starts out saying, we know the truth about politics, and so we're just going to sort of diagnose the people who disagree with us. Anybody who studied epistemology, right? Anybody who studied Descartes is going to have questions about that and about that approach. So that's one thing that philosophers and epistemologists in particular can bring to this. The other thing that epistemologists bring is a sort of normative perspective. In the sense that we're evaluating people's rationality when we talk about political beliefs. And we have we've thought a lot about rationality. We've thought about what it takes for a belief to count as knowledge, what it takes for a belief to be justified. And so it's another place where in other literatures you might see people making a sort of, having a sort of knee-jerk reflex that, oh, this belief can't possibly be justified, or this belief came about in that way, which is obviously irrational. And philosophers are going to be very, very careful about that. And indeed, a lot of the recent philosophical work on these sorts of topics sort of investigates cognitive biases to see if they could count as rational rather than irrational sources of evidence that, might seem irrational until you think about them. If you take topics like polarization or conspiracy theories or fake news, you see that these are terms that are bandied about a lot. Philosophers try to define them, and it turns out to be very hard. And so philosophers sort of improve the rigor, improve the clarity, and improve the terminology of these debates, I think.
So I guess I'll just cut right to the chase here. The short version of the question is, what is a political belief? To kind of flesh that out a little bit further, I think there's a version of this that would say, oh, this is a very kind of internal thing that I come to with my, my own priors and then express. There's a version that says this is a very external thing that I say I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican and I kind of sign on to a party platform. And there's a version that says, well, a lot of these disagreements are disagreements, we'll say maybe about definitions, right? That we just have sort of different basic ideas of what some of these things that we're arguing about mean. So I guess kind of among those three paths, having written this book, maybe you're not comfortable answering it fully, but at least how would you begin to think about disentangling those?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the question, what is a political belief? I think there are political beliefs of all those three types. Certainly, someone can, and there are people who do sort of just, when they notice there's a political controversy, they just sort of dive in and do the research, right? They just sort of do a lot of reading, read a lot of statistics, and just sort of try to figure it out. That's what I guess you call the internal perspective. Um, and I think those can count as political beliefs if they're related to the relevant controversies in the right kind of way. Um, then the external perspective, where people sort of develop these identities or these personal brands that are associated with political parties or sort of subgroups of political parties. You and I are certainly politically aware and online enough to know that, a lot of people, stop identifying precisely as a Democrat and will start identifying as a DSA member or a social democrat or as a centrist Democrat, a blue dog Democrat, and on the right you'll have never Trumpers and nationalists and all these different sorts of things, right? So there's identities at a lot of different sorts of levels, and people definitely do sort of adopt the beliefs that go along with those identities. The question in what you call the external perspective is sort of like, are these actually like sincerely held enough that we should call them beliefs, I guess. Sometimes they seem more like performances that people do in order to maintain membership in a certain social group or something like that. And I think that's just going to differ from person to person. You certainly have people kind of faking it till they make it when it comes to their political beliefs, and a political belief that might be, kind of an act will become a reality, and that's just sort of like a psychological mechanism. Now, the question about the definitions, I think it depends. It depends sort of what type of word is in controversy. So in the book, I talk about these verbal disputes. I don't give it that much time, but I think it is the case that a lot of people who have had political arguments every now and then will find that there's a difference in definition that kind of generates the argument. And sometimes beneath that, there's a difference in something other than a definition. So, for example, around 10 years ago, there were lots of arguments that I would see online about definitions of terms like racism or sexism. And so one thing you might say is, well, this person uses racism to mean X, this other person uses racism to mean Y. So the fact that they disagree about whether something is or isn't racist, that just means they start with a different definition, so it's all just semantics, right? And I think that doesn't always completely get at what's going on. In that case, probably one person found it appropriate to apply the term because they found something very, morally ugly, very morally unpleasant or reprehensible, blameworthy, whatever, right? And the other person didn't. And so that's probably the source of the disagreement there. I do think that, the idea that thinking about verbal disputes points us to is sort of like, disagreements have sources, political disagreements have sources often in other sorts of beliefs. And it can take a lot of work to figure out what is between two specific individuals, what is the source of the disagreement, right? So, say two people disagree about tax policy, they could disagree about what is actually in a proposed tax policy, right? What is actually in the legislation. They could disagree about what counts as fairness, right? They could disagree about how to value fairness versus, say, economic productivity. And they could disagree about the actual real-world plausible effects of the policy. So when you have a political disagreement, you often have to do all this extra work to figure out, well, what do we actually, where does this other disagreement come from? I want to vote this way, you want to vote that way, but let's figure out, what is actually motivating both of us, and, maybe we can learn something, I don't know, hopefully.
So there's a version of a narrative about this that says that, okay, back in, say, the early 2000s, like Bush years, early Obama years, there were, in America, disagreements that went more along factual lines. Which of these, sort of very disparate practically economic policies is going to actually be better for the economy, and that with the rise of wokeness or some of these other kind of more deeply moral political beliefs, that now we're arguing about deeply held values instead. Do you agree or disagree?
I don't know that I agree. I think I disagree. I mean, there may be a trend in that direction. But it seemed to me that in the kind of culture wars of the past 10 years ago, there are a lot of factual disputes. I think there are probably also value disputes, but actually often when people try to articulate the relevant values, they run into trouble. Certainly, thinking about the example I gave before about racism, I do think that, so like the value of colorblindness, for instance, saw a bit of a dip starting around 10 years ago, or maybe starting around 15 years ago and peaking around 4 years ago, maybe during 2020, and is now sort of on a resurgence. So I think that definitely there have been changes in values, and there are differences in values that have led to some of these political disputes. On the other hand, I think there's also genuine factual disagreement on the ground as well. One thing I like to think about, again, this comes from being very online, but I like thinking about not just disagreements that, a lot of political scientists are worried about like issues, they call them issues. It's such a funny word, but, political issues and how do people feel about political issues? Being more of like an online, like culture war person, I'm just as interested in like these flashpoint events, right? So what leads people to some news article comes out, what leads one person to think, oh, this really happened, and another person to think there's no way that happened, right? Thinking about, say, well, here's an easy one for sort of what I think of as sometimes being my side. Around 5 years ago, there was an actor named Jussie Smollett, who claimed to have been assaulted by two Trump supporters in Chicago, I think, with the "Make America Great Again" hats on, and it turned out he had paid two guys to beat him up or something like that. I don't remember the whole story. I don't want to libel Jussie Smollett here. That's my memory of the story, and I could be completely wrong. But it seems like there's a sense the causal source of that disagreement probably is like some people think, oh yeah, it's just like America is a horrible place to be a black person, and you're constantly under physical threat. And some people don't think that. That might be the causal source. But when it comes to the Flashpoint event, there's still sort of just like the empirical question of like, did this actually occur? Like what were the events that actually occurred? So I think that although, and even the question of, is it horrible to be a member of this race or this gender, that's not necessarily a question of values either, right? Everybody might agree on what it means to have a pleasant or unpleasant life, and they might just disagree about whether those conditions are met and whether they vary sort of demographically. So yeah, I think that the one thing that I think people have to watch for is that the disagreements about values can sort of generate factual disagreements in a way that is really, that I think is actually irrational. So, people can say, well, this must have happened because we live in this sort of society. Or they might say, well, the world is fair, so this couldn't possibly have happened to this sort of person. And I think that's always going to be irrational. You have to do sort of, I believe in, the Humean perspective, that you have to think about your facts and your values separately. You have to sort of come up with one and then come up with the other, and there's sort of very different kinds of inquiries. I don't know if that makes much sense.
Well, a couple times now, you've referenced being very online and kind of the technological aspect of political belief. And I definitely want to ask about that. But first, I mean, what I guess is the advantage of you having written a textbook specifically about this topic? What about it do you think needs to actually be like inculcated in the classroom?
Yeah, so I think that I probably maybe tried to do a few too many things at once with this book. So the textbook just came out of, I had taught a course on this topic, and it occurred to me that it might be a good thing to turn into a textbook. And then I met a guy from Routledge at a conference, and he said, "Do you know anybody who's working on a textbook?" And I said, "I was thinking of writing a textbook." He said, "Oh, maybe we can publish it." So it just worked out really well. Again, starting around 10 years ago, in analytic philosophy, in analytic epistemology, and social epistemology, there started to be this research on things like the rationality of polarization, analytic standpoint epistemology, which is sort of like the demographic equivalent of class consciousness in Marxism, and just some other topics like that. There was a resurgence of interest in conspiracy theories, resurgence of interest in motivated reasoning. People were talking about echo chambers, online echo chambers, and what are called filter bubbles. And so it was a good time sort of professionally within analytic philosophy to bring some of this research together. And it also seemed to me that, some of it was quite good and some of it was not quite good. And so it was a good time to sort of like impose my will on the subdiscipline of political epistemology. I think, part of what attracted me to the topic as a teaching topic was sort of like, when you teach intro to philosophy and say, we're going to do this we're going to be very clear and rigorous in thinking about like, whether numbers exist. And, maybe a lot of smart people will say, I can apply philosophical rigor to that sort of question, and I'll stay in the Platonic heaven. Well, for me, because I'm a Platonist. For other people, you're not in the Platonic heavens because they don't believe numbers exist in that sense. But in, this very sort of abstract topic, they can think very clearly and, remove maybe some of the warping emotions that they have about it. And then, and this is what I observed from philosophers socially from when I started my master's program at Tufts over 12 years ago now. Well, maybe not at Tufts, but as I started to argue with people online and stuff like that within philosophy. You just noticed that the people who were so rigorous in thinking about things like whether numbers exist, then would come to the political issues of the day, and would have sort of no understanding, no argument, and no sense that rigor was even appropriate. And so I think that was part of what motivated me, was just the feeling that I can apply some of the tools that we ought to be applying that are sort of missing when it comes to these kinds of topics. And I did find that it never hurts if you're teaching something that students are actually interested in. Philosophy departments are looking for students right now, like a lot of humanities departments. And this was a class that engaged people. I think the social, as much as the political element of this sort of class, this sort of topic, when I taught it, I think engaged students talking about things like, how do you know who to trust? Should you go along with the people around you, or should you disagree with them? Things like that. That's something that like a lot of 20-year-olds are worried about, maybe more than they're worried about whether numbers exist. So I found it like a pretty good topic for teaching, a pretty good topic within the professional context, a pretty good topic within the philosophical context, and within this sort of real world context. So it just seems sort of like the right time for a book like that. And hopefully people are reading it. I don't know.
Well, so let's draw the threads together then with the kind of online discourse element of it. Especially as someone who has a very pronounced online presence, do you feel that that is kind of shaping the nature of political belief in any significant way? And I'll just toss in, I've certainly observed in terms of like trust in information, and you talk a lot in your book about trust in experts as opposed, or, you know, conspiratorial thinking, that there's just, I mean, sort of for obvious reasons, much less trust because of AI.
Yeah, well, AI is certainly a great example. I mean, I don't think I'll ever really trust my students again with AI out there, and maybe they won't trust me either. Yeah, I certainly observed the effects of internet discourse on how people view experts. That's a great example. Certainly affects political polarization. You know, when I first started using Twitter, and I had a very small account, I would observe sort of journalists talking to each other about some topic, and sort of it felt like they were sort of coming up with the narrative in real time, the narrative that would be how the topic was presented to people. This was in a sort of different era. You know, this was the height of Trump was just elected. We don't have to be objective. You know, democracy dies in darkness. We should tell people what to think. You know, we have a responsibility to be very political. And I think you're seeing the effects of that now. You know, there was just this news story about the Washington Post. There's a big shakeup there, and the new editor was like, "You guys don't know what you're doing." Basically, nobody's reading the Post anymore because you guys are too biased. You guys have too much of an agenda. I'm probably, you know, being a little creative in my interpretation of what was written there. But it definitely affected me, and it affected the way that I read the news, for instance. I've developed what I call this like smell test for, you know, something is reported, and I just think, well, that doesn't seem right, so I'm gonna wait a few days before I, you know, say that to anybody else. And often it won't turn out to be right. And this was something that, you know, I'm always looking for new cognitive skills to have. The first time I noticed this was in I forget what year it was. It was around a decade ago. It was in the early days of what might be called wokeness, and there was a story at the University of Virginia that was reported in Rolling Stone magazine where a young woman alleged that she had been sort of sexually assaulted by an entire fraternity. And I knew a few people who just right off the bat were like, that did not occur, that did not happen. And at that point I was still, so how can you say that didn't happen? You know, we have to believe people when they say horrible things have happened to them. And once they turned out to be right, I realized, like, I really want to have that skill. You know, I really want to just, from the vibe of something, know whether it's plausible or not. I guess before then I was a very trusting, very gullible person, which has affected my life in, you know, all sorts of ways as you can imagine. And so I think that was, you know, in terms of my personal political transformation, that sort of thing was a big part of why this topic really stuck out to me, because, you know, I think you have to figure out, how am I going to develop heuristics? And I don't think, you know, I think it's something that maybe for a future book, or maybe a project somebody else will be better at, who's more of a natural at this, but just you know, some kind of development of heuristics about how do you know, just reading something, it probably didn't happen, or that you need to wait for more information. And so that was something that really affected me. And I think the low levels of trust, you know, I was at this event in Vienna in February where they were talking about how do we raise level. Well, I was the one who brought up the word trust. They were talking about democracy, and I was like, well, it's really all about trust. But they were talking, so they said, you know, so how do we raise the levels of trust? How do we make people trust the media again, trust the experts again? And my view is basically like, well, you should be more trustworthy. Like, you have to earn trust. And it certainly is true that there are people who go overboard. There are crazy conspiracy theories. There's QAnon. there's like, left-wing equivalents and, non-politically dominant denominational equivalents. So people can go overboard with the lack of trust, but I think broadly speaking, it's a time when nobody really deserves to be trusted.
Ooh, harsh.
Yeah, well, who knows? We'll see. Maybe that's my hot take for the day.
Yeah. Yeah, without trust, how do you kind of form a political belief? Because at a certain point, you just have to, like, make a decision. I mean, from what kind of you've said, it does strike me, and maybe this, makes sense just kind of given the definition of politics, but it does seem to me from what you've said that maybe there isn't such a thing as an individual political belief. Like, you're either basing it off of what some expert says or what your party around you says or what your family says. I mean, it doesn't really strike me that any of the examples that we've talked about are actually particularly organic with people.
Yeah. So I do think... So one thing that I don't talk about much in my book that other people have written about, and that I do think can be interesting, is thinking about just this question of, is there a way to get the right kind of information to form a rational, justified political belief without relying on experts, the news, things like that? So you might think that things like, your own personal experiences, say, with some government agency might lead you to have at least some evidence for opinions about what should be done with that agency, right? And of course, all of these sources, the experts, the news, these are going to be somebody's firsthand information, right? It can't just be like, it can't be reports from other people all the way down, right? So, when you read an article about something that happened in the war in the Middle East, it was it was written by somebody who witnessed it, or witnessed a video of it or something. So their knowledge is much more immediate. I do think that in terms of, well, so for example, a lot of the types of political beliefs that I think people in these debates are concerned with are sort of at the national or even international level. So things like, what should America's abortion policy be? What should America's immigration policy be? What should America's tax policy be? Should we be supplying arms to the Ukraine? Should we be supplying arms to Israel? Things like that. Those are the sorts of big, huge political issues that people are concerned with in this sort of literature. And certainly you can't form beliefs about those sorts of things without getting information from a ton of different sources, right? You might have personal experience with just one corner of these problems, but they are so big and complicated that it's really hard to imagine that you could really evaluate them without trusting somebody else, without getting information from somebody else. One thing that a lot of people I know have thought for a while, and this is not like a politicized political belief, this is something that people on all sides of politics, I think, believe, is that the average person is probably much more equipped to and will be much more helpful to their society if they are to participate in more local politics. And they may be able to have firsthand knowledge of, like, are the roads in this area falling apart? Do we need more police in this area or that area? Do we need... I don't know. I know so little about local politics that I can't even think about what the right local political issues are off the top of my head. And certainly local politics in a way can be nationalized, right? So there's the YIMBY-NIMBY debate about housing, which is sort of, housing regulations are determined at the state or maybe municipal level. And so this debate is sort of redone over and over again. You have the same things with unionization debates. One of my brothers was a union organizer for a while, and going into a workplace and trying to convince the people to unionize is sort of, everybody's worried about their local conditions, but at the same time, you start to see patterns that occur in different places. So local issues sort of can be nationalized or can be generalized. But yeah, I think that local politics is going to be the best opportunity for people to have relevant firsthand knowledge. And in terms of national politics, there's no way to get around trusting somebody. If you believe a conspiracy theory because you don't trust the government, you have to trust the people who told you that this is the specific conspiracy that's going on, right? QAnon has to trust this Q guy or whatever. I don't even know if they even still exist. I don't know.
I'm afraid I'm not a QAnon expert.
I don't know.
I
don't know
help
anything.
you, Oliver.
I'm sorry. I don't know anything about them.
Yeah, I think it's tough because in my experience, local politics, my experience, I hope there's someone out there whose experience is different, but in my experience, local politics are at least as dysfunctional as national politics, maybe just dysfunctional in different ways, less partisan, more just straightforward incompetence, including, I'm thinking about, my city hall and their bureaucratic regulations and what have you, but including, campus elections and stuff. It's just actually shocking. Super smart, motivated kids at really good schools who just, the whole thing is, I guess part of it though is kind of what you're saying, where people will be, they'll be giving campaign speeches on ending racism and U.S. policy in Iran, and you're like, I would have been satisfied with mozzarella sticks.
Yeah, I do think, okay, so campus politics are a kind of local politics, but also, most people who get involved in campus politics, and honestly, this is true for a lot of people in local and state politics as well, a lot of people who get involved in politics at one level are not necessarily just looking to improve things at that level and stay at that level. And so the politicians themselves, and this includes sort of campus politicians, if that's a phrase that people use, are usually looking to relate themselves and their lives to some bigger issue that they can then use as whatever kind of springboard. But yeah, campus politics, I've certainly written a lot about campus politics. Campus politics are their own sort of issue, and the politics of the academy are so, I don't know. I don't even know what to say about them. They're so, in some ways, they're just completely divorced from the real world.
They're also not, if you're talking about the whole academy, they're not fully democratic, which changes the dynamic a lot.
Yeah, of course, and there's the question of for somebody, for an adult, not an undergraduate, but for an adult, well, even an undergraduate, right? You have to be admitted to be involved in the politics of a certain campus. You have to be admitted or hired. And there's various, as a postdoctoral fellow here at Princeton, I wasn't necessarily, I'm sort of at the bottom of the totem pole, I was told, in terms of the, I think somebody said it goes...
Sorry, Oliver, I didn't know someone told you that you were at the bottom of the totem pole.
Somebody told me that the undergrads are the most important, and after that is the faculty.
Wow.
After that is the grad students. And
wait, undergrad's above faculty?
I think so. Just because of because the faculty... I think at a school like Princeton, the faculty already aren't going to be presidents and senators and things like that, right? Whereas the undergrads might be.
Oh, interesting.
That's just the vibe that I got. But I also don't. This happened in September, and it was probably mostly a joke. But yeah, so campus politics has all these weird things, and I do think the question of what even makes campus politics, or to what extent even is it politics, is an interesting question. The mozzarella sticks, if there's a very animated pro-mozzarella stick and a very animated anti-mozzarella stick contingent, I can imagine that becoming something that seems very political.
And in a sense, it's not a political issue because who would be? I mean, what's the anti-Muslim?
Who would be against it?
Someone just like hates other people, is allergic to dairy, and hates other people having joy. Yeah,
could be vegan, or could think that maybe the mozzarella sticks are unhealthy, or maybe they're not, they're not environmentally friendly or well sourced or something like that. But yeah, it is hard to imagine why somebody would oppose mozzarella sticks. But yeah, so I think campus politics is an interesting test case for what even makes this politics, and then the relationship between that and I think what's more usually called academic politics within the faculty, which is often about like, well, are we going to hire somebody who does something I think is interesting, or somebody you think is interesting, or like which grad students are we going to bring in, one thing. So in philosophy, one of the most political debates is about transgender people. This has been one of the most fiery debates in philosophy for the past 6 or 7 years, I think. And a lot of philosophers think that, like, in some ways this debate is actually about, like, how to do metaphysics, and the metaphysics of gender, which to me seems probably false. Or at least that there's a political question that goes outside the academy, and then a sort of within philosophy question about metaphysics, and those questions really have very little to do with one another. And it's sort of like a misunderstanding of the role of the academics to think that, and the power of academics to think that us doing metaphysics the right way or the wrong way will have all these effects, when nobody's going to read us doing like nobody outside is going to read us doing metaphysics to begin with. That's also part of why you were asking about this book before. Sorry, I'm like going back and forth about stuff here. But you were asking about the motivation for this book. I do think that while I was in grad school, I came in with a lot of things to research that I wanted to research, and I sort of started to form the view that, especially in philosophy, which can do so much to like shape young minds in the right way. There's a lot of underestimation of the role of teaching and the responsibility that we have to teach well. So I think writing a textbook partly came out of that. I do think in some ways teaching is our most important job. We think our research is so amazing and it's going to save the world if we just do metaphysics right. But that's almost certainly not true. And the biggest effects we probably will have will be on students instead of teaching them to think clearly, rigorously, calmly.
So, I mean, going back a little bit to the conversation we were having earlier about the sources of people's belief, I mean, in your book you have 2 chapters, one on expertise and one on tradition, or I don't remember, maybe it's a couple paragraphs, not a full chapter on tradition. I was partial towards the tradition chapter.
Of course, yeah.
I know, you were like, I saw that coming a mile away, but mostly because you cited G.K. Chesterton. And I was like, yes, an academic book with the Chesterton reference. Yeah. But talking about Chesterton's Fence, which maybe I'll give you the space to explain rather than me mangling it. But one thing that kind of struck me as I read those 2 chapters is that it is, in a way, kind of fundamentally the same type of thinking, whether you're putting your faith in whatever, some group of expert or kind of tradition because of, what's the word? Empirics, yeah. I guess you could say. Would you agree with that assessment? Do you think that there are other examples of things where there's sort of a left wing and a right wing take on basically the same way of thinking?
Yeah, so I think, in a way, this is what we were talking about before, right? Where we can't get away from the problem of trust. The problem of trust in political belief is like what word am I looking? Unget away from.
Unescapable.
Inescapable. God, I'm getting old. Inescapable. Trust is an inescapable problem. So the way epistemologists use the word expert, it's sort of like built in that you should trust the experts. And the problem is like, how do you find the experts? Most people, when they talk about trusting the experts, they're talking about a sort of sociological class rather than like people who know a lot, right? It's like an open question whether the experts, people can't see it, but I'm making the little quotation marks with my fingers. It's an open question whether they actually know a lot. And same thing with the philosophy of history stuff. I just found it very interesting that there was this, are things getting better? Are things getting worse? And how does that relate to the question of trust? Should we trust people from the past when they say, this is why we built these institutions, this is why we built these things? Chesterton's fence has this idea that if you don't know why something's there, don't bust it up, don't pull it down, because maybe you'll figure it out. Maybe the problem that it was there to solve will suddenly, hit you. And I certainly think that this is something. I think Chesterton is right, and I think it's this alone should not make somebody a conservative, but I think it is in some ways a conservative insight that liberals and progressives should take on if they can. One thing I've noticed in some of the culture war stuff is this lack of understanding of how fragile things can be. So we were talking about the Washington Post before. I think that's a great example where there was this institution that said, well, we have this huge platform and we're going to use it for what we think of as good, to be progressive and to go after Trump and the conservatives, because democracy dies in darkness and so on. And it didn't occur to them that operating in that way could actually undermine as storied and enormous an organization as the Washington Post. But it turned out that the Washington Post was quite fragile. We see this in the things that have occurred this year in the Ivy League, right? I think, 5 or 6 out of the 8 Ivy League presidents lost their jobs this year. I think Salovey at Yale was going to quit anyway. But these are not bulletproof organizations. These are not bulletproof institutions. And the same thing goes for, and this is a topic I think you'll be interested in, the same thing goes with just words. The same thing goes for the connotations of words. So we talked before about this idea that, maybe there was some change in the definition of a word like racism. And so people had these political disagreements about whether something that was racist that could be based in a disagreement over the meaning of the term. Well, I think one idea that people had was that you can sort of keep the connotation of a term fixed, but change the definition, and then you sort of are doing good by stigmatizing things that people think are okay. So you're making, these things are actually bad. Some people think they're okay, but we're going to change the definition of this word to apply to these things so that now people will know that they're bad. But actually one effect of that was that it went in the other direction just as much, right?
Well, let's give an example of this chain of effect.
Yeah, so I think, another hot take, but I think racism is an example where the negative connotation of the term was weakened. And in fact, in Steve Bannon, after the first Trump election, said if somebody calls you that, you sort of say okay, you just say okay, because it doesn't mean as much anymore. I call these watering down. I have some other term for it which is cuter, but yeah, these are the watering down effects that we have on these terms. Kate Mann, a philosopher at Cornell, had a very, very well-received book called Down Girl, where she basically does this with the term misogyny. And she says outright, misogyny is a term with this sort of negative, she calls it a flavor. It has this negative flavor. And so let's just apply it to the things that we don't like, and then everybody else won't like them either. This is just a very strange way to operate, right? Because connotations are fragile. Institutions are fragile. Organizations are fragile. And the world can change very, very quickly. And the things that other people have built can fall down. In a way, this is an insight that a previous generation of revolutionary academics understood, even though they sort of mocked it. Well, I'm just really going off of the title here. I forget what's actually in the piece, but Foucault has a book called Society Must Be Defended, which always seemed like a very conservative title to me. So yeah, the notion that things have to be defended, that things have to be maintained, or else they fall apart, and that things can't be changed so much without knowing what the effects are going to be. I think this is basically, in some ways, a conservative insight. And, it's a way of trusting without maybe trusting a specific individual, where you say, well, it's all working to an extent, right? It's all working, sort of. And so I at least trust, I trust the way it's set up, because you trust the things that have proved themselves. And I think there's always this tension between people who say, well, let's not change it because, it's what got us where we are, and other people who say, well, it's not perfect, so let's make it better, right? And this is where you get the idea that, progressives are perfectionists, and, you get this sort of middle ground, like incrementalist, like Burkeanism. But yeah, it plays in political beliefs, right? In basically the same way.
I mean, your discussion of liberalism in the book was brief but packed, and it touches on a topic that is very important to the Madison program, neutrality. Mm-hmm. And I am wondering if you could comment a little bit on that. I mean, it seems like kind of a tough topic, because on the one hand, in many ways and in many circumstances, it feels kind of impossible. And on the other hand, it can feel so indispensable that, for instance, a textbook like yours couldn't really be taken seriously unless it came across as somewhat neutral. Yeah,
so I think neutrality... So first of all, I mean, there's a lot to say about neutrality, and neutrality comes under such attack. In a sense, neutrality can be thought of as the heart of liberalism, but, I think most people, when they think about who to trust, going back to the problem of trust, most people are looking for neutrality from others, right? So if you go to the doctor, and the doctor says, you have a cough, and the doctor says, well, you have this disease, you have cancer, that's why you're coughing. And, obviously you're very upset, and then somebody tells you, well, the doctor really, really likes diagnosing people with cancer. That's just something that the doctor really enjoys. You might start to think, I shouldn't trust this doctor, right? Because the doctor, and the reason is the doctor isn't neutral, right? The doctor isn't neutral between cancer and not cancer, right? So, neutrality is basically a condition of trust in a lot of these circumstances. Now, neutrality comes in degrees. It's probably impossible to have it entirely. One thing to say is that, so say you have children and you say, here are the options, we can get sushi, we can get pizza, or we can get fried chicken, I don't know. And your children get to pick. So you haven't been neutral, you've picked 3 options, you've eliminated everything else, but you're neutral between those options, right? So neutrality comes in degrees in this way, that you can sort of employ neutrality at any level of any process, right? Now, neutrality is difficult but not impossible to get. Actually, there's biblical passages that, and I don't know much about the Bible. I was raised atheist, but there's biblical passages where people try to figure out how to have neutral procedures, right? Things like, one person cuts, the other person chooses, right? When deciding which half of land they would get, right?
You had to put me on the spot on air.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I always think of it with cake because I love cake.
Yeah, I feel like I've heard this before with cake.
Yeah, so how you divide the cake. And the thing is, the question of how to divide the cake is basically Rawls's question.
Yeah.
And the answer is basically Rawls's answer. The veil of ignorance, everything in Rawls is so misunderstood and is so thought of as having all this machinery behind it, because he tried to get away from various complaints and to make it generalizable in the right way. But like all Rawls is saying is basically like the mechanism by which you cut the cake should not be the same mechanism by which you choose your piece, right?
Right.
The way to be fair is to separate, deciding what the pieces are, and deciding who gets what piece. And that's like and everybody understands that when we think about cake, right? When we think about cake, everybody understands that. So that's why a lot of the complaints about neutrality and fairness, I can get a little impatient because everybody understands this. So that's me on neutrality, I guess. I do think that, neutrality has certainly been in the news. There are these, and at JMP, obviously, we keep an eye on. Harvard has an institutional neutrality statement. Stanford has a new institutional neutrality statement. I do think that, so one thing to think about when it comes to institutional neutrality is, again, like I said, neutrality comes in degrees, right? So probably Harvard and Stanford will be, in general, neutral on the questions where they judge it to benefit them to be neutral, and not as neutral on questions where they judge it not to be beneficial to be neutral, right? That's my cynical view. And I do think that the recent rise in institutional neutrality is probably prompted by the presence of a campus issue where there is genuine division of opinion and where eschewing neutrality would go incredibly poorly for any campus if they went in either direction, right? And I suspect that the neutrality may just go out the window again. But I think that the problem of neutrality is related to the problem of trust, and the fact that institutions take sides is a big part of why people don't have trust in institutions anymore.
So to start to close this off here, I know you're a philosopher, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to ask for some kind of more practical takeaways from your book. I mean, given what we've been discussing so far about the nature of political belief and the difficulty of kind of having independent political belief and the questions about where and how do you put your trust, do you have any thoughts on how to actually kind of go about having conversations about and surrounding a political belief that you're hoping people will take away from your book?
Yeah, that's a good question. The book certainly had fewer practical recommendations than I might have hoped. I do think there are some lessons about how to deal with disagreement. Don't stay at a certain surface level disagreement, but try to figure out the source of the disagreement. I think there are some lessons about, thinking about where our own political beliefs come from. One of my favorite articles that I talk about a lot in the book about polarization as a kind of sorting or packaging is by my friend Rishi Joshi, who did his PhD here. He talks about what to do when you notice that all your political beliefs basically fit a party platform. And he says, well, if your beliefs fit a party platform, you should be less certain of them, because party platforms are sort of like irrational. They're not that they're irrational, but they're rational in this other sense. They're sort of like strategically rational. They come about through the negotiation of, the parties trying to, win voters and historical contingencies and things like that. So Rishi thinks, if you notice that you have this identity that comes from a party platform and that it relates to your political beliefs, you should reduce your certainty in your political beliefs. I think that in general, just being critical of our sources, thinking about the fact that we've been led astray before, this can be really important. And I do think that near the end of the book, I do these I do a little bit of an attack on the notion of fake news and a little bit of an attack on the notion of conspiracy theories and stuff like that. I do think it can be good to avoid these what they're sometimes called these thought-ending cliches when it comes to other people's political beliefs. Where you say, well, I don't have to think about that because it's just a conspiracy. I don't have to think about that because it's just fake news. In general, like in so many things, we should be harder on ourselves than we are and easier on other people than we are. And that's like the best way to learn. And I think the same thing goes for political beliefs. We should avoid these cliches when they apply to other people. And we should think harder about how they might apply to ourselves.
Thank you so much, Oliver. This has been super interesting.
Good. I hope so.
Well, there you have it, Madisonians. Oliver Traldi on his new first book, Political Beliefs. It's linked in the show notes if you want to check it out. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating or review. We really appreciate it. You can also find out more about us and what we do here on Princeton's campus at jmp.princeton.edu. There, you can sign up for our mailing list, you can see our schedule of upcoming events, and you can also access recordings of the previous events that we've hosted here at Princeton. You can also find us on social media, on Twitter at Madison Program, as well as on Instagram and Facebook. Again, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next week here on Madison's Notes.